Hey Webters, Mr. Lassiter here with you, and in this video we're going to be looking at the nature of the Great War, not just looking at it from the Western Front and Eastern Front and what happened in battles, but kind of looking at it from a few different angles and looking at the effects which stretch to the home front and to imperial territories around the world. And so hopefully give you a really big picture in this video today. Of course, we started with this last week thinking about the optimism versus horror that war brought. The optimism that occurred before the war and the horror of actual warfare. And to really understand that, you have to think about what was going on in battle. The western front of this war was between France and Germany, and it ran all the way through Belgium. And even though Germany made some pretty quick advances at the start of the war, both sides literally dig in and don't really move much for the duration of the war. They're literally bogged down in trenches. There's a stalemate which develops mainly because of new technology, guns, barbed wire being used in war, gas weapons, and that really just makes both sides unable to really break through. In fact, with the Allies and the Central Powers, they were just hoping the other side would run out of men first, and both sides start to run out of men. But with the United States entering the war, it really forces Germany backwards. Now, the United States enters the war really for three main reasons. First reason is that Great Britain and France were seen as democracies more like what the United States had. So the United States naturally sided with the Allies. But there were a couple other things that occurred during the war which also led the United States to siding with Great Britain and France. And that included unrestricted submarine warfare and the sinking of a ship called the Lusitania. Germany had developed U-boat technologies and had committed to wreaking havoc on Atlantic shipping, especially British and French shipping. Of course, the United States traded a great deal with these countries, and so any boats were targeted. The United States warned Germany several times, but it was the sinking of the Lusitania that really pushed a lot of people into calling for the United States to go to war. On May 7, 1950, the Lusitania, which was an ocean liner carrying more than 100 U.S. citizens, it was sunk by a German U-boat. And so people started making calls of going to war. Remember the Lusitania. However, the United States was fairly isolationist at this time. We did not see a need to get involved in European war. And it took another event, the decoding and the interception and decoding of the Zimmermann telegram in January of 1917 to really push the United States into war. What happened with this was that Germany had sent a telegram to Mexico offering to help Mexico reclaim its lost territories that they had lost the United States in the Mexican-American War if they declared war on the United States and allied with Germany. Now, of course, the United States did not take kindly to this and entered the war on the side of the Allies. On the Eastern Front, the Central Powers quickly overran Serbia, Albania, Romania, but Russia had taken the offensive early on on the Eastern Front, which stretched basically from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. However, Russia certainly mismanaged their troops in war, and they were not ready to fight this heavily industrialized war. And so eventually they are pushed back. By the end of Russian involvement in this war, they were sending troops into battle severely under-equipped. Some were sent into war with no guns. They were not providing enough food for their soldiers. Some soldiers sent with no shoes. And this caused mass desertion. Of course, in Russia, there was also shortages of things, and that led to a loss of confidence in general in their government. This will lead to revolution in Russia and their ultimate withdrawal from the war. This gives you a little bit closer look at the map there, showing the western front of the war and the eastern front of this war in Europe. Now, you could argue about who faced the greatest obstacles in this war, but clearly Russia went through a great deal of change as a result of World War I. There was already instability within Russia, but the government mismanagement of this war led to increased discontent. The fuel and food shortages that occurred during the winter of 1916 and 1917 caused massive uprisings in Russia, especially in St. Petersburg. And eventually, in March of 1917, the Tsar Nicholas II was overthrown, and the Romanov dynasty, after being in control for about 300 years, collapsed. Nicholas II and his family were also ultimately assassinated or killed. A new provisional government was put into place in Russia with liberals and socialists and conservatives kind of all vying for power in this new provisional government. But ultimately, a specific group of Soviets, the Bolsheviks, will rise to power. And they were led by the man you see pictured there, Vladimir Lenin, who at the time the war broke out was actually in exile in Switzerland. But the Germans, knowing that Russia is on the brink of a collapse, sneaks Lenin back in to lead these radical socialists in the hope that this would cause Russia to exit the war. And it eventually did. Lenin came back. He promised peace as a leader of the radical Bolshevik Party. And the Bolsheviks seized power in November of 1917 after they staged an uprising and overthrew the provisional government. About 4 months after seizing power, Lenin appeals for peace with Germany. And in March 1918, the new government of Soviet Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, ending their involvement in World War I. Now that is a lot to think about taking place and leading to Germany's exit in the war. As a result of exiting the war, Russia did face a great deal of penalty. They gave up a large amount of land, including most of the Ukraine, but it did give the Bolshevik government time to concentrate on establishing rule and their Marxist communist state in Russia. They did have to deal with a civil war for about 2 years, and in about November of 1920, the communists were able to finally declare victory over anti-communist forces in Russia. And that's pretty much how we get the Soviet Union, guys. Now, this war certainly raged on in the Western Front and the Eastern Front, and it involved these allies and Central Powers. And of course, we've seen what it did with Russia and how the United States entered the war. But we have to remember that this was a total war. It was not just fought by militaries, but was also fought by the nations involved, their domestic populations. They were also committed to winning this war. Entire economies were dedicated to winning the war. Millions of people went to work producing munitions. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers than ever before. There were planning boards which established production quotas. They set price and wage controls. They rationed food and other materials. All of these things were aimed at winning the war. And if you dissented or did not think that this war was the right thing to do, well, then you better keep your mouth closed, because censorship was, especially media censorship, was enacted to make sure that everything was going toward the war. In fact, people who criticized the war efforts in any of these countries could be imprisoned. Of course, on the side of the state, they sought to get as much support for the war as possible, and so they utilized propaganda to influence attitudes toward the war. There were major recruitment campaigns. The countries involved in the fighting demonized the other sides. For example, French and British propaganda would fuel hatred and bitterness toward Germans and German troops. And you can understand why then, when the Treaty of Versailles is signed, there is such kind of bloodthirst for blaming the Germans for this war. But this was a total effort at home, and so that's something that you have to kind of keep in mind. It wasn't just the troops went off and, oh, they lost, but this is a devastating loss for Germans. This is a nation-building win for the Allies. Of course, as I said, we have to look at this war from many different perspectives. We looked at it from home. Let's look at it from the perspective around the world. This was not just a European war. It was an Asian war. It was an African war. It was a war fought in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. And the boundaries of war had expanded because of imperialism. For example, the British seized German African colonies in this war. And the war was fought in East Africa, just as it was fought in the Middle East, and just as it was fought in Europe. Japan even enters the war as an ally in order to gain access to German colonies, places like the Marshall and Mariana Islands. They also want control of German ports in China, like Qingdao, and they get those ports as a result of the end of the war. But if you were a colony of these European countries, you were probably also involved, even if the fighting was not in your territory specifically. For example, troops from the British Empire, from Canada, fought in Europe. British and French troops from places like French Algeria or British India were lured into fighting with the promise of independence or eventual independence. Anzac's forces from Australia and New Zealand fought at Gallipoli against the Ottomans. The Arabian Peninsula even saw the British and French encouraging nationalist forces to fight against the Ottomans in a way to destabilize the Ottoman Empire. The British promised two different families the throne of a new Arabian kingdom. Eventually, the Saudi family would be given control, and the independent country of Saudi Arabia would be declared. In fact, it would be the only of those Middle Eastern countries to be given independence. The British and French would establish mandates in the rest, but more on that later. Excuse me. So these troops, as you can see in these images, really were from everywhere. This was a total war. Of course, there were other promises being made as well, and something I think it's a good time to go ahead and mention now, since we were talking about promises made to Arabs, are the British promises that are made to Jews as well. By the early 20th century, there had developed a nationalist movement known as Zionism, which had developed and wanted a Jewish independent state in their homeland, the homeland of Israel. And so the British in this time realized that this is something that they might want to look at doing. And in the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the British suggested that they would view with favor the establishment of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine. Of course, the British promotion of the resettlement or the settlement of Jewish people in Palestine led to some conflicts that they really did not foresee with this declaration. And of course, we will talk more about this at great lengths here in time period 6. But again, something that occurs during World War I that will have long-lasting consequences. When the United States entered the war in 1917, it definitely turned the tide in the West. As Russia was exiting on the Eastern Front, German troops were starting to shift over to the Western Front. But the United States provided the troops that would lead the push to break the stalemate and lead to the Central Powers' ultimate defeat. An armistice was officially signed on November 11th, 1918. You may have heard of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and that's what that is in reference to. The day became officially known as Armistice Day. Now in the United States we call it Veterans Day, but still known as Armistice Day in many places. And it ended what had been approximately 4 years of bloodshed. Between 8 and 9 million soldiers died in World War I, and about 21 million more were wounded. Over half of the French, German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian soldiers that fought in this war came home with some type of injury. So that would be less than half came home unharmed. Excuse me. Of course, the mental effects of this were not well known at the time, but you can imagine what those might have been. There were other atrocities that occurred too. Civilian casualties were fairly common. Between 6 and 13 million civilians were killed, wounded, or injured in some way as a result of this war. And some of these atrocities were particularly egregious. In the Ottoman Empire, in what is now known as Turkey, Christian Armenians were targeted by the Ottoman government because they were believed to be sympathetic to the Russians. So the Ottomans forced Armenians to move from their homes to prison camps in Syria and Iraq and other locations. This led to massive deaths. Starvation, disease, execution, exposure to the elements led to the deaths of between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenians. Today, this is referred to as the Armenian Genocide. It is often considered the first genocide of the 20th century, but certainly not the last. Although this is still debated in international realms, the country of Turkey refuses to acknowledge this as a genocide, as many places around the world have. They believe that these deaths of Armenians were acts of war, or responses of the Ottoman government to acts of war. But this, in much more recent times, has been acknowledged as a genocide by more and more countries. War led to many of these casualties and many of these atrocities. But there were some atrocities as a result of people returning home from war that were not as predictable. And that was mainly a result of the Spanish influenza epidemic. In 1918, just as soldiers were beginning to return home from war, and you can imagine going home to their countries all around the world, the United States, Canada, their homes in Europe, their homes in Africa, and India, and Australia, a particularly vicious strain of influenza also spread around the world. This epidemic became a pandemic as approximately 20 million people were killed worldwide, 7 million alone in India. This led to the cancellation of sports seasons like the high school football season for the Varasta High School Wildcats, my high school, the only year that football was canceled since they began playing it. And it was a result of the spread of this particularly vicious flu outbreak. But this flu epidemic certainly was a result of people moving around the world and interacting with each other in much greater numbers than ever before. And it pretty much added insult to injury. If you can imagine, this flu killed twice as many people or twice as many people died as number of soldiers died in the war. So that's not a small number, and it is a significant effect. In fact, it was the topic of the document-based question a couple of years ago on the AP exam. So what does this mean for this war, or for what's going to come after this war? We will certainly look at the Treaty of Versailles and whether or not it was fair, and the effects on the Middle East with mandate systems and the like. But there was a few areas that this war did not affect, and kind of the broad loss of a sense of security, the major hopelessness that is going to be felt by the world, is kind of captured in this term, the lost generation. Many people who of the generation which experienced this war would feel this hopelessness, would feel this loss of a sense of security, and will permeate society in the interwar period, and kind of lead us spiraling toward perhaps a Second World War. The term originally was applied only to American expats living in Paris after the war, but eventually came to really describe this general feeling of a generation which had seen so many of its brothers and sisters devastated by this experience. It would also lead to major changes in the outlook of this newly global world, and certainly led to things like Russia becoming communist, Japan expanding their imperial empire, the United States becoming a world power, and Germany being punished for causing it all. Whether they did is a question for another day. All right, guys, that's it. Thank you for hanging with me through this. If you have any questions, let me know in class. Have a great day.